Welcome to this week's Cologne Correct. On this episode, the Colt 727. Stand by!
Alright dudes, welcome to episode 4 of Cologne Correct. Today I'm 10 years and 2 belt holes into DD214 and chill, and we're going to learn how to properly clone everyone's favorite, the Colt 727, also known as the M16A2 carbine. Now, the M16A2 carbine in U.S. military service has a very confusing history, with different sources all having different takes on the subject. It is intertwined with the XM-4 carbine, which later morphed into the officially adopted M4 carbine. So, in order to cover all of the bases and get the entire story, we're going to delve into the history and parts evolution of all M16A2 carbines. We do know for certain that the XM-4 program under Colt produced the first examples of the XM-4 in 1986. These property of U.S. government marked carbines were produced for the U.S. military testing in very limited numbers, primarily tested by the Army. The Colt Model 727 came shortly afterwards for law enforcement, commercial, or export sales. It joined the Colt 723, which had already been on the catalog for several years. I use the model numbers rather generically, as Colt did produce a handful of other models in identical configuration that might have a different model number based on something as simple as burst versus auto fire control. When the U.S. military stalled in the adoption of the XM-4, some high-speed units purchased the Colt 727 as a commercial off-the-shelf or COTS purchase. I have no source for the actual numbers fielded, but it became more prolific than the Colt 723, as the 727 was fielded by the Navy SEALs, other Navy elements like their EOD, which is normally attached to SOF, the Army's 75th Ranger Regiment, other Army SOF elements, as well as elements of the U.S. Air Force. As these were COTS carbines, they were not U.S. property marks. Most units, including plain vanilla Army SFODAs, continued to use the M16A2. In addition, the Navy and Air Force did take older carbines and rifles and rebuild them into general 727 configuration. The M4 and M4A1 carbine was finally officially adopted by the U.S. military in 1994, although actual deliveries to the line didn't seem to happen for another year or two. Here's where the story gets even weirder, as there's a lot of debate among amateur historians about the subject. The big question being if early U.S. property marked M4s had fixed carry handles. As far back as 1994, the U.S. military produced manuals using the M4 nomenclature. This 1991 Armorer's Manual, which includes the 1994 dated, change number 3, shows an M4 carbine with fixed carry handle and 3-round burst. The NSN used is the same NSN that was established for the XM-4 back in 1986. Other period manuals show and label the M4 as having a fixed carry handle. Every other veteran from the time period swears up and down that they saw an M4 with a fixed carry handle. The textbook answer is that the first run of M4s had fixed carry handles, but no photos ever seemed to surface. To make it even more confusing, the NSN that was once used for the M4 listed Colt as the primary contractor and 727 as the part number. When we look at museum pieces, we find that serial number 2 and serial number 3 actually had fixed carry handles, but serial number 4 already has a detachable carry handle. Strangely, serial number 1 went to a line unit and didn't end up as a museum piece for some odd reason. Now, I don't have any photos to show you, as the photos that I'm referencing are in a book, Vickers Guide AR-15, Volume 2, 2nd edition. So instead, here is my semi-automatic clone. So, the subject is not settled, and likely never will be. About 1999, I noticed this discrepancy in the U.S. military manuals and decided to write the proponent agency at Rock Island. Needless to say, they never wrote back, probably because they didn't know either. In the late 90s, when production of flat top and fixed carry handle rifles overlapped, Colt transitioned to the 777 for commercial law enforcement sales export. The Colt 777 differs from the 727 in very minute details, which we'll cover later. As far as I know, these were never procured for U.S. military use, as flat-top carbines had already been adopted. But upper receivers were procured as replacement parts around this time. So, to recap the models, we have the XM-4. We have the COTS 727. We have rebuilds that were put into a general 727 configuration of A2 carry handle and 14.5-inch barrel. We have U.S. property marked M4s with fixed carry handle. And then finally, we have the Colt 777. Most of us, of course, know the 727 or M16A2 carbine as one of the rifles used by the 75th Ranger Regiment during the 1993 Battle of Mogadishu. It was immortalized in a book and later a movie adaptation. In the movie, 727 configuration rifles were used as a generic carbine for all users, even ones that used 723s and other carbines in real life. High-speed units that rated carbines seemed to keep them long after the M4 and M4A1 were officially adopted. This is where my experience with the 727 begins. When I first started to deploy with the Army in late 1995, it was still common to see the Colt 727, while the plain white-side vanilla SFODAs that I worked for already had the flat-top M4A1s. Rifles and carbines built into M16A2 carbine configuration continue on to this day in the Navy and Air Force. The Navy did take many of their COTS M16A2 lowers that they had and rebuilt them into Mark 18s. Like I mentioned in the last episode, always consult photos. The M16A2 carbine is such a broad cloning subject, it's a necessity. First, let's talk in more detail about the XM-4 trial rifles and their parts. As a trials rifle, there is a bit of variation as both Colt and the military figured things out. Now, early rifles used an A2 upper receiver, slim handguards, and the 14.5-inch, 0.625-inch diameter lightweight barrel profile from the 723. The textbook answer is that only 25 of these were made. The next batch of XM4s moved to the unique XM4 barrel profile, the old aluminum buttstock, but there were no other changes. All the photos of these that I've seen, this batch were all property of U.S. government M16A2 marked. The third batch, they moved to the plastic N1 stock, the new fat M4 style handguards, and they also moved to a side sling swivel for the barrel sling attachment point. This batch, the lowers were actually marked XM4. This photo was had to have been taken sometime after 1993, as it shows in Aimpoint Comp M. Now, I've also come across photos of XM-4 rifles with a modern M4 barrel profile, very similar to the 727. Now, I'm not sure if these were from the factory or swapped as part of testing. Carbine barrels start to gauge out after 8 to 10,000 rounds, which would have been an easy feat during testing. Now, on to the COTS 727s. Like the other A2 carbines we talked about in the last episodes, the 727 was part of the commercial law enforcement export line. So there's going to be quite a bit of variation of parts during production. The only constant is a 14.5-inch barrel, 1-7 twist, as well as an A2 upper receiver. Like the XM-4, the earliest rifles used the lightweight barrel from the 723 and an aluminum stock. This is the only photo I've ever seen of one of these rifles in actual military use, and it is plausible that this is some sort of armor special. But the textbook answer about the first XM4s being in the same configuration does fit. After that, the 727 moved on to the M16A2 carbine profile barrel. This is very similar to the modern M4 barrel. The stocks, handguards, lower shape, all of that will vary. Again, while a U.S. purchased rifle, it was not a U.S. adopted rifle, so there's not really any set standard. It's just whatever Colt had in the parts bin that day. The U.S. military rebuilds into M16A2 carbine configuration, really anything goes as long as the part had been introduced by that time. U.S. property marked M4s with fixed carry handle. As a U.S. adopted rifle, these would have had a fixed configuration. Now, based on the museum piece photos, it would have been an N1 stock, 4-position extension, modern castle nut, A2 lower, modern M4 barrel, and fat handguards. The Colt 777, the U.S. military didn't buy these, but as best as I can tell, these are identical in configuration to the U.S. property marked M4s. Now, are there any turnkey clones? Colt did make the AR-15A2 government carbine model 6520 from the late 1980s onwards, but it has a 16-inch lightweight .625-inch barrel. A 1st Ranger Battalion veteran that I've talked to told me that they used carbines in identical configuration. Now, I'm not sure if he was talking about an early 727 or perhaps misremembering their later 727s that's easily verifiable in photographs as something else. Of course, since there are no turnkey clones, you have to build it yourself. So let's delve into the parts. And while we already touched on it briefly, now we're going to discuss parts variation or in torturous detail, as well as the commercial alternatives. Buttstock. Colt used up the last of the metal vinyl acetate stocks before switching over to the plastic N1 stock. The aluminum stocks were used on some XM4s and some 727s, and of course rebuilds. N1 stocks were used on the rest of XM4 production, most 727s, the U.S. property marked M4s with fixed carry handle, the Colt commercial 777, and some rebuilds as well. Colt originals are easy to find today, but aren't cheap. The metal stocks are up to $500 these days. Luckily, there are reproductions of both, and both are excellent in quality. It's very difficult to tell the difference between them. There were M16A2 carbines being used after the new waffle stock was introduced about 2001. So if cloning any rifle as it appeared after that, you could get away with one. The SEALs did use 727s with fixed stocks. I haven't seen them in person, but if it's like their fixed stock M4A1s that I have seen in person, then they were actual 727s with fixed stocks added later and not some oddball lower with 727 upper. The two-position receiver extension was used on the COTS 727 carbines, most of the XM-4s, and probably some of the 777s. The modern four-position is the same shape and was used on most of the 777s and U.S. property marked M4s. Colt was still using up two-position extensions off and on commercial rifles all the way until the early 2000s. With rebuilds, obviously anything goes. The four-position extension is still being made today by Colt. Two-position Colt originals bring a hefty sum. The two-position, there are some companies making near-perfect reproductions. The old-style castle nut was used on the COTS 727s and the XM-4s. Colt originals can sometimes be found, and again, perfect reproductions can be easily found as well. The new style was used on the U.S. property marked M4s. The rebuilds, anything goes. The 777 on paper was the new style, but of course, being a commercial item, there were exceptions. The U.S. property M4s, it's a similar story. The museum pieces have four-position extensions and new style castle nuts. The 1994 Armorer's Manual shows the old style for both, and the part numbers listed were established in 1986, which would imply that they were the old style used on the XM lowers. The XM4s, U.S. property M4s, and 777s used A2 lower profiled lower receivers. XM4s are property of U.S. government marked and either marked M16A2 or XM4, depending on the run. U.S. property M4s are marked M4. The 777s being a commercial item, it will vary, but the commercial M4/M16A2E seems to have been the most common late 90s roll mark. COTS 727s will be both the new A2 profile as well as A1 profile lowers that have A2 markings. Remember, these are not U.S. military items, so there is no set standard. Markings are standard commercial M16A2 markings. Rebuilds, anything goes. Everything from Colt 601 lowers to even modern M16A2 rifle lowers being backdated into a carbine. Some retain their original markings, others not. International Milco and H&R both make A1 profile lowers, even with M16A2 COTS markings. The modern H&R receivers use the old Nodak spud forging. That forging has several errors, most notably around the buffer tube area. It does not meet my standards, but it might meet yours. You could also use one of the obscure lowers from 30 years ago that I talked about in more detail in the M16A2 video. That approach is exactly what I did. More recently, Bad Attitude Department, a company that already makes a slew of clone and tribute lowers, recently started to show a new A1 shaped lower. From the photos on their website, not bad, and time will tell if it's a good alternative. The Colt A2 receivers from the 80s and 90s are unique in shape and different from the modern lowers sold today. Colt made the change about 2002. Colt A2 profile. The only way to get one is either a period Colt or find one of the obscure commercial lowers from the 90s that use the same profile, which ironically, those are harder to find than the Colt ones. My favorite method when starting an M16A2 carbine project is to find a used law enforcement Colt AR-15A2 government carbine, model 6520, and use the lower half or the complete rifle. I have done that with 727, XM4, and U.S. property M4 projects. With that method, you get the proper lower, a factory receiver extension, a factory staked receiver extension nut, and an N1 stock. With what these parts go for in the secondary market, it's cheaper in the long run. And since we're on the subject, using a complete 6520 and swapping out the barrel is another favorite, as you get a matching Colt upper and other bits that you don't have to hunt down. If doing a rebuild with early partial fence or no fence lower, then modern reproductions are both being done by H&R as well as International Milco. If doing a rebuild with a modern lower, then you can either use an FN lower or really any other modern lower. Pistol grips. From the factory, the Colt 727, XM-4, most 777s, and the US property M4s would have used the fat A2 style grip. This grip is different from the modern grips sold today. There are no commercial alternatives, so you are SOL unless you can get an original Colt grip, which are easy enough to find. Colt changed grips in the late 90s, which FN and others were already using, so some of the Colt 777s may have received them as well. Rebuilds, anything goes as long as it was in the system by that time. In the mid-90s onwards, the Lone Star Ordnance stowaway grip started to show up in US SOF, so this might be an alternative. Originals aren't cheap, but B5 makes a reproduction that's good for most of us. Upper. The XM4, most COTS 727s, and many rebuilds all use the same A2 upper. Feed ramps were one of the changes implemented with the XM4. Forge code was CM. This transitioned to a CMB forge code about 1993-94, which was used on the US property M4s, perhaps some in 727s, and most, if not all, of the 777s. The rebuilds, anything goes, to include rifle receivers. Colt did start to use a CAF forge code sometime in the early 2000s, so it is plausible that some of them were used on M16A2 carbine rebuilds or very late 777s. If you can't find an original Colt, like I did, then there are plenty of reproductions floating around the market. The modern uppers with square forge code seemed like the closest cosmetically. Forward assist. Two primary types were used. Like other members of the M16A2 weapons family, the large D-shaped forward assist was used earlier in production. It was used on the XM4, as well as some early 727s, and then, of course, rebuilds. The smaller, round, standard forward assist was used on almost all 727s, the 777s, the US property marked M4s, and many rebuilds. Again, with rebuilds, anything goes. Barrel. There are 4 different barrel profiles that are possible with the M16A2 carbine. The first run of XM4s, the very early 727s, and some rebuilds use the same 14.5 inch, 0.625 inches in diameter under the gas block, lightweight barrel from the Colt 723. Commercially, there are options in the original 14.5, 14.7, and 16-inch links, which I went into detail on during the 723 video. The XM4, the majority of the rifles seem to use the unique XM4 profile. Obviously, finding an original would be an impossible task. Luckily, it's close enough to the modern one that anyone with a lathe can make one. They use a 0.750-inch front sight base, but are turned down in a few more areas versus the modern M4 barrel. That is exactly what I did for my XM4 project. The majority of COTS 727s, this changed to a new M4 style barrel that's 0.750 inches in diameter under the front sight base. This same barrel was used on some rebuilds as well. These M16A2 carbine barrels do have a slightly different profile than the modern M4 barrel, which is located near the grenade launcher groove. But it's so small that I barely notice, even side by side. Period barrels are marked like this with a C in parentheses. The US property M4s and 777s, as well as some rebuilds, did use a modern M4 barrel profile that's exactly the same as the modern M4 barrel, but with a factory-pinned A2 front sight base. Front sight base, like other fixed-carry handle carbines, the M16A2 carbine used an A2 front sight base, which is lower than the modern version intended for flat tops. They used to mark modern front sight bases with an F, but that isn't done as consistently anymore as it's no longer a mil-spec requirement. Today, finding an original 727 or 777 barrel is difficult, as when the A2 carbine was in production, the MP5 still reigned supreme. So there were not many law enforcement sales, and it was still before the trend of putting a 5.56 rifle in every squad car. Law enforcement rifles are often the most reasonable price source of period Colt parts. 727 barrels and uppers were never released to the civilian market officially, but Colt did release a batch of 777 barrels and uppers in the late 90s. When they do surface these days, unless you get lucky and find a seller who doesn't know what they have, they are in the hands of resellers who charge a premium. With 14.5-inch barreled carbines burning out barrels and breaking bolts in the 8,000 to 10,000 round range, I question the logic of spending that much money for a used 30-plus-year-old law enforcement upper that probably came from a SWAT team. Luckily, there are A2 carbine barrel alternatives which are close enough. Wyndham Weaponry makes a great alternative. It is the old style 727/723 profile, 14.5 inches, 1 7 twist, proper steel, and with a factory pinned A2 front sight base. The only downside is it's not parkerized under the front sight base. I have no experience with them, but BKF Firearms makes a nice modern M4 barrel with a pinned A2 front sight base, 1 7 twist, proper steel, and chrome lined. TNTE offers a similar barrel. No idea of these companies' reputations, so be sure to do your due diligence. The firearms industry seems to attract the worst people on earth. You can also roll your own using a modern M4 barrel and having the proper A2 front sight base pinned on. I went that route using a Daniel Defense barrel, with the work being done by John Thomas at Retro Arms Works. Came out great, but wasn't economical. Finally, you can use a modern M4 barrel assembly and live with a higher than normal front sight base. The conventional wisdom is you might have difficulty adjusting your front sights, but I've never tried it myself. Front sling attachment point. This changed quite a bit. The standard A2 sling swivel was used on the first run of XM4s, 727s, some 777s, and some rebuilds. The old M16A1 side sling swivel that was intended for M203 hosts was used on most XM4s, the XM4 barrel being turned down in that area. The new side sling swivel that was developed for the M4/M4A1 was used on the US property M4s, most 777s, and some rebuilds. Bear in mind that the modern side sling swivel is different than the period one. The period one allows both A1 and A2 barrel diameters, while the modern one is A2 only. Flash hider. The only flash hider used was the A2. From the factory, all carbines would have had the peel washer, as the crush washer wasn't introduced until the early 2000s. Rebuilds, obviously, anything goes. Most units that used M16A2 carbines didn't rate suppressors. The 75th Ranger Regiment then transitioned from 727 to M4A1, and suppressor overlap actually ran the other way, with their Ops Inc. suppressors being used on M4A1s. The Navy, they weren't a big suppressor user during this time, and it looks like they were using the NT4's ancestor during the transition anyway. Other USASOC units seem to have gotten the M4A1s years before the NT4. Behind the fence is a possibility, although they were never a big user of the 727. Optics, nothing really standardized, so it's all unit specific. The Aimpoint 3000 and 5000, as well as the Aimpoint Comp M type, have all been observed depending on when the photo was taken. Precision Reflex makes the original version of this mount if you are interested. 4x32 ACOG TA-01s, both standard and NSN from the SOPMOD kit, were used by the Navy and Air Force. 3.5x35 TA-11s were used by the Navy and Army. Leopold 1.5 to 5 power Variax scopes used by the Navy SEALs on their recce rifles. Leopold 10 power scope from the M24 used by Ranger Battalion. Colt, of course, did market the 727 with their branded 4 and 3 power scopes. Then there's this cool setup by the US Air Force with a PRI gooseneck mount and EOTech 552. In the accessory arena, it's always better to consult photos. I've done a few clones over the years, but only kept 3. This first one that you're going to see photographs of, I cloned an XM-4. My build used a Colt 6721 lower that was grayish, but had an old style castle nut. The upper was a proper CM marked carbine upper. The barrel was custom and started life as an FN 14.7 inch M4 barrel. My local gunsmith turned it down to the proper profile based on photos that I found online. The reparkerization, as well as the front sight base and A2 flash hider pinning, was done by John Thomas at Retro Arms Works. The optic is a Swarovski 1.5 power Cobra scope, which is the same scope used on the Steyr AUG. This was sold as a tactical scope in the 80s and 90s, so it seemed like a good fit. I wanted something different than another Aimpoint or another ACOG. While a cool build, I had like 6 M16A2 carbine builds, either done or almost done, so when it came time to purge projects, it was one of the ones to go. This next one, also a photograph, is a clone of a US property M4. For this, I found a Colt AR-15A2 from the 90s with proper castle nut and then swapped out the barrel. Also sold. This third one is a clone of a rifle that started me down the clone path 30 years ago. I cloned a cool 727 that I saw while deployed to Bosnia in the winter of 95-96, which was being used by an unknown RSOF element. For this one, I found a Colt AR-15A2 government carbine from 1995 and then swapped out the barrel with a Colt 777 type barrel. The flash hider does have a spacer, and then it's pin and welded so that the rifle remains Title I. I did add a few period accessories. The CAR 15 marked cheek piece is something that Cherokee Arms used to make and is one that I bought at a gun show in Fayetteville in 1996. And then the TA-11 ACOG is a period correct ACOG, and so it matches the overall configuration of the rifle that I saw. The pistol grip is a Lone Star Ordnance pistol grip. Now, I don't really remember what the original rifle had. However, when I did need an A2 pistol grip for another project, I decided to steal it from this rifle and then add the Lone Star Ordnance grip as it was period correct and period appropriate, and there is a strong possibility that the original rifle had one anyway. And then of course the butt pad is the John Mason butt pad, which does need to be zip tied on. This fourth one, I was looking for a cool suppressor host for the new Allen Engineering M4 suppressors when they did another run a couple years ago, and found a photo of a cool 727 online. The 727 was being used by a Ranger reconnaissance element. To match the rifle that I was copying, I used an Eagle Arms A1 shaped lower receiver. Added a Colt vinyl acetate covered stock, Colt A2 grip, which might even be the A2 grip from this rifle. The receiver extension, end plate, and castle nut are all takeoffs from the same Colt rifle. So when I torqued it down, I was able to get that factory staked look, even if it isn't factory staked, but what are you gonna do? The upper receiver is a Colt CM marked carbine upper receiver, Colt handguards. The barrel, I couldn't find a Colt barrel at the time, so I cheated up, not down, and then found a Daniel Defense M4 barrel, and it had a new M4 or new front sight base pinned on. A generic extended scope mount, which these type of scope mounts were very popular with the 75th Ranger Regiment, and then an Aimpoint 5000 XD. Now the 5000 XD has the same body as the 5000, but with updated internals, and it has less of a collector's value, so I didn't have to spend a bunch of money to get one. Then of course, for the dummy cords, I used zip ties, which was also done during that time period. This third rifle, which I'm going to show a photo of, is a Navy tube gun that I'm going to show later in detail in another video. It's currently getting some other modifications done, as I was able to find some new reference photos and make a few subtle changes to make it more accurate. All right, dudes, if you made it this far to the end, thank you for watching. Please be sure to like, share, subscribe, and all that noise. And be sure to check out my other Clone Correct videos, which you're going to see some links pop up for right now. Till next time, dudes.